Thank you so much, Choral Union Ensemble, for the gift of music as you have led us. And thanks to all who make it possible for us to worship in this way, for those who are on cameras, those who are in the studio, the control room, for everyone that organizes and makes this possible, I want to say thank you. So today we're completing the sermon series, Followership. We're thinking about following Jesus, has its ups and downs. And today's Transfiguration Sunday, in our text that we heard read a moment ago, it was the Common English Bible version, and it says that Jesus was transformed, which is the way that same word is generally translated, even in other translations. Transfiguration is the traditional translation of that word, and it has to do simply with Jesus being transformed in a spectacular way with his inner circle of disciples. But let's set the context for that. Jesus takes his disciples up from Galilee to the north to a place called Caesarea Philippi. And it's at Caesarea Philippi that Jesus asked an important question. They're surrounded by niches carved into the mountainside, representing a lot of different gods. In that place of the worship of the god Pan, where there was a temple there, Jesus asked the question, "Who do you say that I am?" to his disciples. And they gave answers of first he asked, who do people say that I am? And then the more pointed question, who do you say that I am? And it's Simon Peter that answers, you are the Christ. You're the anointed one of God. And Jesus then shares with his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and there be arrested and put to death. But before he makes that journey to Jerusalem, he takes his disciples farther to the north, up into the mountains. And on a mountain there, he takes Peter, James, and John with him. They go up to the mountaintop, and it's there that Jesus is transformed in this spectacular way. His clothes are dazzling white, and suddenly Elijah and Moses are there with him on that mountaintop. And these disciples witness this. It's an amazing experience. There, Moses, who represents the law, and Elijah, who represents the prophets, there on the mountaintop, this idea of the fulfillment of the law and the prophets in the person of Jesus, who is transformed in this way, dazzling light, the light of the world. Oh, the message of who Jesus is powerfully proclaimed in that moment. So it's a mountaintop experience for those disciples. But then they go down into the valley. And down in the valley, in the passage that follows this one, we read about a need that's immediately presented. The valley is the place where there's pain and where there's need. And there are the other disciples, powerless to do anything about this epileptic boy. But Jesus heals him, makes him whole. And the question, again, that circulates is, who is this person? What is the nature of this person who is able to do this? And that's the question that surrounds this story of transformation, transfiguration. And what does that have to do with you and me when it comes to following Jesus? I think it reminds us that we have mountaintop experiences and we have valley experiences. And our lives are lived in both of those places. There on the mountaintop, that's the place of clarity, a place of inspiration, a place where the nature of Jesus becomes crystal clear and it all makes sense and closeness to God. Those are the mountaintop experiences that we talk about, that we experience. And sometimes we want to stay in those places. We just wish that that's where life was lived. Simon Peter certainly wanted to stay up there. His words to Jesus were, "Why don't I build 3 booths?" Or in our translation we heard a moment ago, 3 shrines. Let's just enshrine this moment. Let's just stay here and this is where we'll live. But it just isn't that way. You go down from the mountaintop experiences and often into a valley that may be, as the psalmist said in the 23rd Psalm, the valley of the shadow of death. The valley is the place of weakness for those disciples that are down there, a place of helplessness sometimes. The valley is a place of need and of pain. And in following Jesus, we have the mountaintop moments and we also have the valley times as well. Friends, this week has been a valley time, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the horrific accident that happened on I-35 and the loss of life and the loss of one of our dear members and friends and a leader in this church, Chris Vardy. A valley time. And following Jesus takes us up to the mountaintops, and also we experience those valley times. It is those mountaintop experiences that provide us the insight and the strength and the reminders that we need for the valley experiences. Sometimes we are at the end of our ropes. We don't know where our strength will come from when we are in those valley times, and that's when we know that God gives us the strength that we need that we didn't know we possessed. Through the years, I have read epitaphs from old cemeteries, and the epitaphs used to be engraved on gravestones that would say something about the deceased, about the way they died sometimes, but mostly about the way they lived and what they valued. And there's one of those that comes to my mind when I think about the strength that we need in the valley times. And it simply said, she did what she couldn't. She did what she couldn't. I love that phrase. She couldn't do the good things she did. She didn't have the strength to do those things, but she did them because her strength came from outside, from someplace else, from God. The mountaintop experiences of clarity and inspiration, of closeness, those feelings of closeness to God, those are the times that help strengthen us for the valley experiences. But I want to make sure that we don't think for a moment that God is up on the mountaintop. Christ is on the mountaintop and not down in the valley, because the disciples aren't the only ones that go into the valley. Jesus goes right into the valley, right into the heart of where the needs are, right into the place where people are hurting. God is present with us in the valley times. We're not alone. And sometimes it's easy for us to lose sight of that. It's easy for us to lose sight of how we are called to follow. It's easy for us to lose sight of the presence of God in the dark valleys, or when we become so busy that we're not paying attention to what's going on around us. Sue Bender, a writer, said this. She said, "I found myself living life waiting for something to happen, waiting for God to do something. And then I started looking around to see what God was doing. And as I looked around to see what God was doing," she wrote, "then I began to see miracles. I began to see God at work in the world. I began to see that God is doing something. And I became a part of what God is doing." Followership means that. It means being transformed and made new. Paul uses the word that's translated transformed in our text for today, or transfigured. In fact, in the New Testament, it's only used in this story and twice in Paul's letters, once in 2 Corinthians, the other in Romans. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says that we are being transformed into his likeness more and more, into the likeness of Christ more and more. As we follow, then the one who is transformed also is one who transforms, who makes all things new. And as we follow Jesus, then more and more we are transformed into his likeness, who he calls us to be, who God created us to be. Also in Romans, Paul uses the word. He says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And it's in that same passage that Paul calls us to be living sacrifices. I mean, for Paul's first hearers, surely that was an oxymoron. A sacrifice is some creature offered on the altar in the temple. But Paul said we are to be living sacrifices, those who give of themselves, and in so doing, in following the one who was transformed on the mountain, we are transformed. The season of Lent that we're about to enter into is a time for thinking deeply about what it means to follow Jesus. In this season of Lent, we will be particularly thinking about how it's darkest just before dawn, how darkness gives way to light, how Good Friday gives way to Easter, how after death there is resurrection. And during this season of Lent, we'll be thinking deeply about what that means as we live our lives. And the good news that it may be dark. We may be in the valley, but there are mountaintops, and there's a sunrise coming. Amen.